Welcome back to Revenge Files, where we tell true-to-life, soul-stirring stories of family, dignity, and justice, served cold, but never cruel. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It helps us keep the lights on and the stories honest. Settle in, turn the volume up, and listen closely. Title: They sent me a bill for the wedding I wasn't invited to. So I bought their wedding photographer's company. I was sanding the splintered edge of an old maple frame when the envelope slipped through my mail slot like a white moth. It skittered across the entry rug and came to rest against the toes of my boots. The return address wore a cursive flourish. The Hales, as if the name itself were a curtain raised on a better play. I stood there a moment, palms dusty with powdered maple, the smell of varnish and coffee hanging together in the air like two old friends who'd learned to share a table. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. A father learns to live with a certain kind of clairvoyance, the quiet kind you get from memorizing hospital monitors and tuition invoices and mortgage coupons. Paper tells on people. Paper always does. Still, I opened it. Inside sat an itemized bill for $6,480.72. Flowers, chair rentals, an honor chair display I would never sit in, and a contribution line bolded in confident ink. Parental support. Father's share. I read it twice because disbelief has bad eyesight at my age. I traced a thumb over my daughter's name, Emma typed in the top corner beneath her fiancé's, and then lower, a neat, professionally cheerful note. Thank you in advance for helping make Emma's special day perfect. They were right about one thing. It would be special. It would just belong to someone else. A person can walk around with two hearts, the one that beats and the one that breaks. The beating heart kept me upright as I carried the envelope to the kitchen. The breaking one remembered a barefoot toddler clapping at soap bubbles in a sink, the way her hair smelled like rain and baby shampoo, the way she used to fall asleep in the car seat, head tilted back, mouth open, trusting me to steer us safely home. I set the bill next to the coffee maker and stared at the numbers until they blurred. The morning light came through my window and laid itself across the table like a pale tablecloth. When you live alone long enough, light learns to keep you company. I called the number on the invoice. A young voice answered, cheerful and efficient, the way customer service people are trained to be when they're counting on the script to save them. Hello, this is Frank Delaney, I said. I received a bill for my daughter's wedding. There's been a mistake. I'm so sorry for any confusion, Mr. Delaney, she chirped. This is standard. We invoice both parental parties for their contribution. I wasn't invited. A pause, thin, papery. I'm so sorry to hear that. Would you like to dispute the charges? The word dispute is a small word that imagines itself bigger. It can hold a parking ticket. It cannot hold a daughter. No, I said. No dispute. I just needed to hear a person say it out loud. Say what, sir? That the world has gotten strange. When the call ended, I rinsed the bitterness out of my mouth with black coffee and walked to the garage. That's where I keep my small workshop, a leftover life from when hands and eyes could fix what words could not. Once upon a time, I shot weddings on weekends, back before phones learned to lie about beauty, back when people hired you to pay attention. I still have a darkroom fan that hums to remind me there was a season when you could watch an image bloom out of nothing, the way faces emerge from fog. I picked up the frame I'd been sanding. It was for a photograph I keep on the mantel Emma at 9, front tooth missing, holding a blue ribbon from the county fair. She raised that rabbit herself. When I took the picture, she'd asked if I could make the background look like a storybook. I did. I shot wide open, softened the edges, Let the sun comb her hair into gold. There's a way to hold a camera that says, "I see you." Parents should learn it early. By noon, the bill had become its own weather. It followed me from room to room, turning off radios and dimming lamps. The phone buzzed with texts from old friends. "How are you holding up, Frank?" Which is how news travels in a small town. Over fences, in grocery aisles, through people who don't mean harm, but still manage to carry it. I answered politely, because that's what men like me do when pain knocks. We lended a folding chair. At 2, another envelope arrived. This one bore the logo of Sunline Studios, the wedding photography company. They'd photographed half the town's milestones: proms, baptisms, grandparents in Sunday best. The letterhead announced a limited-time package upgrade for family members, written the way a salesman might speak to a man too distracted to notice he's being sold an umbrella in the desert. I read it because habit is a stubborn animal. Then I read it again because something in the layout tugged at a thread in my memory. The owner's name. Marcus Clay rung a small bell. Years ago, before Sunline bought out the old camera shop, Marcus sold me a second-hand enlarger for $20, less than fair, because I came in with Emma, who kept both palms pressed to the glass display like a pilgrim at a shrine. "You're raising a museum," he'd said, smiling. "Teach her about light." I dialed the number out of nothing more than restlessness. Marcus answered on the second ring, voice older, edges softened by years of selling perfect moments to imperfect people. "Marcus," I said, "it's Frank." Frank Delaney. Frank. Good grief, the man who still knows what a light meter is. "What can I do for you?" I told him about the bill. I told him I wasn't invited. He swore under his breath, the way decent men do when they can't fix your hurt, but wish they could. Then, because honesty is a door that opens to other doors, he told me the truth about his business. He was tired. Tired of editing smiles until they didn't belong to anybody. Tired of chasing invoices. Tired of young couples who believed a wedding album could do the work of a vow. "I've been thinking of getting out," he admitted. "Sunline looks solid from the street, but the numbers are... well, I don't sleep much." "How tired?" I asked. The question arrived in the room without my permission, like a bird through a cracked window. Tired enough that if a man came along who loved photographs for the right reasons, and he wasn't trying to rob me blind, I'd hand him the keys. I said I'd sleep on it. I didn't, not really. I lay in bed and watched the shadows climb my ceiling like slow dancers. Somewhere, a wedding planner was confirming seatings, a florist was plunging stems into green foam, and my daughter was practicing a new signature in some mirror, Emma Hale, a name that fit her like someone else's sweater. The thing about a mirror is that it can show you your face without giving you back your name. The next morning I took a drive. I passed the park where Emma learned to ride a bike, the church where I almost married her mother a second time after we'd learned how to speak to each other more kindly, the diner where Emma and I split pancakes on Saturdays when the weather felt like forgiveness. You might call it nostalgia. I call it inventory. A man should know what he's carrying. Sunline Studios sits on a corner near the courthouse, all brick and big windows, the kind of place that wants you to believe in afternoons. The bell over the door gave a small, surprised ring when I walked in, as if it hadn't expected me to be real. The walls were a gallery of strangers, frozen at the moment before they knew if the cake would taste like sugar or chalk. Marcus came out from the back with a lens cloth in his hand and relief on his face. We talked for 2 hours. He showed me the books. He didn't sweeten them, and I respected him for it. We stood by the front window and watched the town go by, And I told him about the darkroom fan in my garage, and the way Emma used to ask me to make the background look like a storybook. "People think pictures are proof," Marcus said, gazing at the framed couples along the wall. "But they're more like weather reports. You remember the day as sunny, even if it rained at night." I asked about ownership, about assets, contracts, and a small line on a laminated rate card that most people never read. Copyright remains with Sunline Studios. I felt it then, something akin to the click you feel when a heavy door finds its latch. Not vengeance, not exactly. More like the integer answer to a long division. Clean, unarguable. By closing time, we had an agreement in principle. Nothing underhanded. No theatrics. Just a tired man stepping away and a steady man stepping in. On my way home, the sky laid down a thin band of apricot above the rooftops, and the streetlights shrugged themselves awake one by one. I stopped at the grocery for milk and a newspaper because there are certain rituals you keep even when the world tries to convince you it's moved on. On the front page, there was a photo of last year's 4th of July parade children holding sparklers that looked like captured stars. The credit at the bottom read, Sunline Studios. I traced the letters with a fingertip, the way you might trace a scar. Back in my kitchen, the first envelope, the one with the bill still, lay beside the coffee maker, patient as a dog waiting for a walk. I set the newspaper on top of it, aligning the edges until the stack looked purposeful. I brewed a fresh pot. The scent of it rose like a promise that isn't grand, but is good enough to wake up for. When the coffee finished, I poured a cup and walked to the mantel. I lifted Emma's blue ribbon photograph in its newly sanded frame. The glass caught my reflection, a man older than his feelings, the way a tree can be older than its leaves. I cleaned a small smudge at the corner of her smile and set the frame back in its place. Across town, someone was stringing fairy lights over a rented dance floor. Someone was chalking a welcome sign. Someone was paying for parental support with other people's hearts. That was their weather report. I had just checked mine. A person can spend his whole life learning the difference between being invited and being included. An invitation is a piece of paper. Inclusion is a choice. If you live long enough, you learn which one is worth anything. I took one last look at the bill, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a drawer with warranty cards and spare house keys. The things you keep not because you need them, but because the alternative is to admit they never mattered. Then I sat at the table with my coffee and a blank notepad and wrote a simple list. Call the bank. Call the attorney. Call Marcus. Under that, I wrote a fourth line, smaller. Teach them what pictures are for. Outside, the town exhaled. Somewhere, a rehearsal dinner toast was being practiced in a bathroom mirror. Somewhere, a father's name had been edited out of a program because names, like photographs, can be cropped. And somewhere, in the quiet of my little house, a man who had once taught his daughter how to ride a bike laid down a plan as carefully as he'd once laid down training wheels. The world had gotten strange, yes, but I had learned to see in low light. There's a calm in the air, just before a wedding. An artificial stillness, like the world holding its breath. For a moment, it's been told, is sacred. But in my house, that same silence felt more like a funeral. No dress rehearsals, no last-minute tie adjustments. Just me, the ticking of the wall clock, and a camera bag older than most marriages. The day of Emma's wedding arrived the way a storm front does. Expected, yet unkind. I woke up early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because the heart doesn't keep quiet when it's mourning the living. The morning newspaper carried a small feature on the wedding. It was a quiet social event in our town, the kind that earns half a column in the celebrations section. Her new last name was already printed, Mr. and Mrs. Hale. It felt like reading my own obituary. I brewed coffee I wouldn't drink and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I wrote out numbers, names, responsibilities. Then I flipped the page and wrote 4 words in the middle, underlined: control, light, frame, truth. These were the 4 things a photographer learns first. They are also the 4 things a father forgets he has when a child stops looking back. The transfer papers from Sunline Studios arrived by courier that afternoon. Neat folder, single pen. Marcus had signed with a shaky flourish. I read through the clauses again, though I already knew them by heart. Complete rights, back catalogs, active contracts, intellectual property, and most importantly, all copyright ownership of current unreleased projects. Meaning Emma's wedding, from pre-wedding portraits to the sparkler send-off, was now legally mine. It's a funny thing, owning something you were never allowed to witness, like being handed the soundtrack to a life that no longer plays your voice. The files came in that evening, terabytes of footage, raw and untouched. Behind-the-scenes shots, candid clips, audio from the vows. The photography team hadn't even processed the albums yet. Their post-editing workflow was slow, artistic, careful. They didn't know the studio had changed hands. Yet. I sat down at my old desktop, booted up Lightroom, and opened the first batch. There she was. Emma. Not the toddler on the swing set, not the 14-year-old crying after her first heartbreak. This was Emma in white chiffon, hair done in a crown of tiny pearls, her smile composed and curated. Something practiced for months, maybe years. In the next photo, I saw him, Thomas Hale, her stepfather, arm locked with hers as he escorted her down the aisle. There was no trace of hesitation on her face. She looked whole. She looked finished. The image stung, but not for the reasons you might think. I didn't feel betrayed by the happiness. I felt erased by the narrative. A few frames later, I saw the honor chair they'd prepared, the one I was billed for. A single chair draped in white, with a sign that read, "Reserved for Father, forever in our hearts." I choked on my own breath. I was alive. I was alive just 20 minutes down the road. And yet, to them, I had already been placed into memory. That night, I didn't sleep. I edited instead. Photo by photo, clip by clip. But I didn't airbrush, color correct, or romanticize. I didn't soften the shadows or blur the imperfections. I curated truth. There was a shot of Emma nervously rubbing her hands before the ceremony, face tight with anxiety. I flagged it. There was one of Thomas barking at the flower girl for dropping petals too early. I kept that, too. A guest caught yawning during the vows. A bridesmaid texting during the first dance. The groom looking lost at the altar, hands shaking behind his back. I saw what they never meant to show, and it gave me something I hadn't had in months: leverage. The next morning, I met with a friend at the Chapel Hill Weekly. His name's Richard Lasky, an editor with a dry wit and a soft spot for stories with bite. He'd known Emma since she was little. He used to call her Pickle, for some reason only he remembered. When I showed him the photos and explained what had happened, what they'd done, and what I now legally owned, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long whistle. "You could blow up their whole narrative," he said, almost reverently. "I don't want to humiliate her," I said. "Just correct the record." He raised an eyebrow. "By running a full-page expose in next Sunday's Local Faces column?" By reminding them that I'm still here. He looked at me with something between admiration and warning. People don't like it when ghosts talk back, Frank. I'm not a ghost, I said. I'm her father. We ran a teaser the next day. Just one image. A black and white photo of Emma standing alone in the hallway before the ceremony. Bouquet slightly crooked. Lips tight. Eyes distant. Captioned only with, "The story behind the smile. Coming this Sunday." By evening, my phone was ringing non-stop. Calls from local vendors, former clients of Sunline, a distant cousin. But no call from Emma. Not yet. I expected resistance. Instead, I received a cease and desist email from Thomas Hale. He addressed me as Mr. Delaney, as though we were strangers doing battle in court instead of the two men who once split the cost of a bicycle together. He threatened legal action, public embarrassment, irreparable harm to Emma's reputation. I responded with a scan of the copyright documents. No words, just receipts. The kind that don't just end a conversation, they end a fantasy. That Sunday, the piece ran as planned. Page 3, high traffic section. Prime layout. The father left behind, a wedding he never attended, but now owns. It wasn't revenge, it was revelation. The town read every word, not out of malice, but because we live in a world that worships curated happiness and secretly yearns for unfiltered truth. By Monday, the wedding photos Emma had planned to release were buried beneath comment threads and editorials. People weren't cruel, just reflective. She used to adore her father. I remember seeing them at the farmer's market every Saturday. What happened between them? Emma still hadn't called, but Thomas did. And this time, he didn't sound confident. "Take it down," he said. "I can't," I replied. "It already belongs to the people now." He muttered something about dignity, about protecting Emma's peace. I let him finish. Then I said softly, "You should have remembered that before you sent me a bill." And so, the man they tried to reduce to a memory became the author of their public image. A picture might be worth 1,000 words, but a truthful picture? That's priceless. 3 days after the photos hit print, the town buzzed with something between curiosity and discomfort. At the hardware store, 2 old-timers stood near the sandpaper aisle, whispering, their glances drifting my way, and then quickly away. At the coffee shop, the barista paused just a second longer when calling my name, as if to confirm whether Frank Delaney matched the man they now saw in the newspaper. I hadn't become famous. I'd become a headline. And for a small town like Chapel Hill, that was worse. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Langston, a widow, who used to wave from her porch in a powder blue nightgown, didn't quite know how to look at me anymore. She used to call me the nice gentleman with the camera. Now, I was the father who aired family laundry on glossy newsprint. But you know the thing about laundry? It only looks dirty if someone else forgot to wash it. I didn't publish those photos for applause. I did it because I was tired of people rewriting my absence into some tragic, estranged father fairy tale. I wasn't absent. I was erased. On Thursday morning, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Not from Thomas, not from the lawyers, from Emma. She didn't say hello. She didn't call me Dad. Just, "How could you do this?" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the glass behind it cracking. It wasn't anger. It was betrayal. I closed my eyes. "I could ask you the same," I replied. "You humiliated me." "No. I showed people what happened. What you chose. I didn't add captions. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't even comment. I just gave them the full frame." She went silent. Seconds passed. "You weren't there," she said quietly. "I wasn't invited. You knew I was marrying Thomas. You knew what it meant. I knew you were changing your last name. That you let him walk you down the aisle. That you called him Dad in front of 200 people. And then you sent me a bill, as if I was a ghost with a checkbook. Her voice broke. It wasn't supposed to go like this. I softened. Emma, I raised you to tell the truth. Not the kind that looks good in wedding albums. The kind that hurts a little, but heals later. She didn't reply, just breathed, shallow, like someone deciding whether to stay or run. Finally, she whispered, I just didn't want things to be awkward. You and Mom, you and Thomas. I thought it would ruin the day I let that sit. Was I that unbearable? No, she said. You were inconvenient. It landed like a punch wrapped in silk. I didn't speak. She didn't take it back. That night, I sat in the dark room I hadn't used in years. The red light glowed above me like a confession booth. I developed a print of her standing under an arbor of white roses, sunlight cutting through her veil. Her eyes were closed. She looked serene, whole. In another life, I might have framed this, hung it next to her childhood portraits. But not now. I pinned it to the corkboard with a pushpin and sat there, just watching her image emerge from the paper grain by grain. People think betrayal comes in loud moments, shouting, accusations, slammed doors. But it doesn't. Betrayal arrives in paper form, a changed name, a missing invitation, an itemized bill. Later that week, the studio received an email from Emma Hale. She requested that all wedding photos be taken down from public access, that the story be retracted, and that the files be transferred back to the family. I let the request sit for a full 48 hours before replying. Dear Mrs. Hale, thank you for reaching out. As the legal owner of Sunline Studios, and therefore of the wedding photography materials in question, I have reviewed your request. At this time, we are not releasing any copyrights or raw footage. These materials remain property of the studio. Kindly refer to the signed service agreement, Clause 12C, regarding public publication and usage rights. Frank Delaney. I didn't need to sign it. Dad, she already knew. The real surprise came the following weekend. The New England Bridal Review, a small regional magazine that Emma had hoped to be featured in, sent a polite but firm withdrawal notice. Apparently, they no longer deemed the image narrative appropriate for a national spotlight. Translation: too much noise, too much truth, too much Dad. Emma never called again after that. But Thomas did. He showed up. In person. Sunday afternoon. Uninvited. How poetic. I heard the knock at the front door and knew it was him before I even opened it. He stood there in a tailored blazer, looking more like a real estate agent than a son-in-law. His smile was forced. His knuckles were white. Frank. Thomas. You have a moment? No. He blinked. Well, I'll talk anyway. I stepped aside. He didn't enter. I know you're angry, he said, but this isn't helping Emma. She's not a child, I replied. She made her choices. Yes, and now she's dealing with the fallout from your choices. No, I said firmly. She's dealing with the consequences of pretending her past doesn't exist. Thomas sighed, adjusted his cufflinks. Always the politician. I'm willing to offer you a buyout, he said, reaching into his coat pocket. Full price for the studio. You walk away. We call it clean. I stared at the envelope. He thought this was still about money. I shook my head. Thomas, the difference between you and me is that I understand something you never will. And what's that? Pictures don't lie. They remember. He didn't reply. I closed the door, gently. Then I walked to the mantel, lifted the frame of Emma at 9 the blue ribbon, the missing tooth, and whispered, You're still in there somewhere. That night, I began a new folder in my archive. I titled it, "The Truth She Forgot, Not to Use, Not to Publish, Just to Keep." Because one day, maybe when she has a daughter of her own, Emma might come looking for answers. And when she does, I'll be ready with a library of light and the silence of a man who chose not revenge, but memory. Spring melted into summer. The paper that had once carried my name now ran headlines about new school board elections, a record tomato harvest, and a high school baseball pitcher nicknamed Lightning. The noise faded, as all noise does in a town with short attention spans and long memories. But something else settled in its place. Curiosity. Not from strangers, from people who once thought they knew me. An old friend from church stopped me at the gas station and asked if I was okay. A woman I used to play bridge with sent a pie to my porch. No note, just blueberries and apology in crust form. Even the pastor, who hadn't called since Eleanor's funeral, left a voicemail. "Frank, we don't pick our trials, but we sure as hell decide who we are in the middle of them." I didn't return any of those calls. What would I say? That I missed a daughter who no longer used my name? That I had become the legal custodian of memories she tried to erase? That owning truth was far lonelier than being lied about? Sunline Studios, under my name now, had begun to shift shape. I wasn't interested in prom shoots or boudoir bookings. I wanted to photograph honesty. So I put out an ad, seeking clients who want more than perfect pictures. I don't Photoshop scars or straighten crooked smiles. I capture who you are, flaws, love, and all. If you're brave enough for that, call me. At first, no one did. Then came Angela, mid-40s, 2 kids, recently divorced. She didn't want glamour shots. She wanted something she could hang on the wall without lying to herself. "I want to remember who I am," she said, "not who I pretended to be for a decade." I took her portrait with messy hair and tired eyes, sitting on the floor of my studio in a borrowed flannel shirt, arms wrapped around her knees like a fortress. It wasn't beautiful. It was real, and that changed everything. Soon I had bookings from men who lost jobs, women who beat cancer, parents who were raising autistic children, grandparents who missed their spouses. People came to me not for celebration, but for truth-telling. And I photographed them all, quietly, respectfully, like history, worth remembering. Meanwhile, I received regular updates from Sunline's former staff. Apparently, Emma's wedding party had tried to launch a PR campaign online Instagram filters, reels, bridal magazines. But people weren't buying it anymore, because once you show the cracks in the foundation, no one looks at the chandeliers the same way. Even worse, someone leaked the full album I had archived unedited, raw footage, authentic expressions. I didn't do it, but I didn't stop it either. Soon, public sentiment started to shift. Not against Emma, never harshly, but against the performance. One comment thread caught my eye. "It's not that she didn't invite her dad, it's that she tried to rewrite him completely. Every bride wants a perfect day, but not at the cost of the people who raised her." This is what happens when weddings become theater and parents become props. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. One morning, I was developing a photo of a young man holding his father's war medal when the studio door creaked open. It was raining outside. Slow, steady. A woman stood in the entrance, soaking wet, clutching a yellow folder. Emma, my daughter, hair flat against her temples, no makeup, no camera-ready smile. Just her. My first instinct was to brace myself. But I didn't. I just watched her walk in like a stranger who used to live here. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, I read the comments. I nodded. She opened the folder. Inside were several prints, some from the wedding, some older. "I didn't know how much you kept," she said. "I kept everything." She looked at the dark room wall portraits of strangers who trusted me with their real selves. Her voice broke. "I'm sorry I tried to take your story out of mine." I stepped closer, not touching her. "You didn't just take it out, Emma. You replaced it. I thought it would be easier," she whispered, "to build something new without the weight." I didn't say anything. She looked up. "But now it all feels empty, like a book with missing chapters." A long silence passed between us, thick with unsaid things. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a photo. U.S. at her 10th birthday party. She had frosting on her nose, and I was laughing mid-bite. "I want to remember this," she said. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. That night, I added a new photo to the corkboard. Not hers. Mine. Me, sitting in the studio, holding the picture of her at 10, looking at it the way only fathers do, with a pain that doesn't sting anymore, just breathes beside you. I wrote under it in pen, "Reclamation isn't revenge, it's memory that stood its ground." Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about punishing Emma. It was about reminding her, and the world, that erasure is a form of cruelty too, and that the people we try to edit out are often the ones who kept us whole long before the flashbulbs. Emma didn't stay long that day. She left the yellow folder behind, said she needed time to sort her own head out. I told her she could take as much time as she needed. What I didn't say was, I'd already waited years. After she left, I sat at my desk and opened the folder again. Some of the photos I'd seen before. Some were from the wedding files. But tucked in the back was one I hadn't expected. It was a letter handwritten, folded twice, worn at the edges. "Dear Dad, I know you may never read this. I wrote it on the morning of the wedding. I had it in my purse. I almost gave it to you. I guess I didn't have the courage. Or maybe I thought pretending would be easier than acknowledging what I was doing. You weren't absent. You were inconvenient. And that makes me sick to write. Thomas always said, 'Your dad's too quiet, too stuck in the past.' He made me feel like you were something I had to grow beyond. And I let that happen. But when I looked around the room during the first dance, when I saw the honor chair they insisted on putting in the corner, I didn't feel honored. I felt ashamed. You gave me everything, and I gave you silence. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, you were never invisible. I saw you in every good thing I ever became." Emma. I read the letter 3 times before I let myself feel anything. And even then, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because grief has more than one expression, and mine had spent too long hardening into stillness. Instead, I stood up, turned off the desk lamp, and went to the dark room. That's where I talked to my ghosts. The next few days brought something unexpected. Emails. Dozens of them. Strangers, locals, even people from other states who had stumbled across the story online. Some thanked me for standing my ground. Some shared their own stories. Fathers left out of weddings, mothers not acknowledged at graduations, grandparents pushed aside for polished family portraits where image mattered more than roots. But one message stood out. It was from Harold Green, the editor of Small Town Weekly, a widely circulated independent paper that syndicated pieces like mine when they struck a nerve. He'd read my feature. He wanted more. "There's power in unvarnished memory, Mr. Delaney," he wrote. "How would you feel about a monthly column? Something honest, something from a father's perspective, something real. I sat with that for a while, a photographer by trade, a father by life, and now, maybe, a writer by necessity. Because when truth becomes invisible in pictures, sometimes it needs to be printed in words. A week later, I published my first column. Title: The Day I Became a Guest in My Daughter's Story. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was reflective. It asked a simple question. What happens when children stop remembering the people who raised them and start editing them for comfort? The response was overwhelming. Inboxes flooded. People dropped by the studio not to book sessions, but to talk. About their regrets, their estrangements, about Thanksgiving chairs that sat empty for reasons no one had the guts to explain. The column became a quiet sort of movement. People called it the long goodbye. But I didn't see it as goodbye. I saw it as a return of truth, of legacy, of presence. Meanwhile, Emma remained quiet. I didn't push. I didn't prod. Some things bloom in silence. But I did leave a copy of my first column at the mailbox of her apartment. No note, no pressure, just the words. Because I've learned something since all this began. Fathers don't always get the last word, but sometimes they write the first honest one. A few days later, a package arrived on my porch. No name, just a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a USB stick and a note. I found these, from your old camera, from when I was little. I don't remember the day, but I know the feeling. I thought maybe you'd like to have them back. Dash, Emma. I plugged it into my desktop. There they were, photos I'd forgotten even existed. Emma at 5, building a snowman with a carrot too big for the head. Emma at 11, in a Halloween costume we made together from duct tape and leftover curtains. Emma at 14, mid-eye roll, arms crossed, but laughing anyway. Each photo a tiny time machine, and with each one, a whisper. You were there. You always were. That night, I added a new framed photo to the studio wall. Not from a client, not from a wedding, not from a curated moment. Just a father, on a couch, reading a book to a girl, with her head on his shoulder, her eyes already closed. The caption, written in soft gold beneath the frame. The truth they forget until they need it again. Because one day, Emma would remember fully. And on that day, I wouldn't say I told you so. I'd simply open the drawer, pull out the letter she once wrote and thought I never read, and say, welcome back. The mornings had changed. Not in temperature or light summer in Chapel Hill still bloomed with the same slow sweetness, but in weight. The air no longer pressed on me with questions unanswered. There was still ache, yes, but it had softened into something livable. Something like acceptance, but with more muscle behind it. At the studio, I began rearranging the gallery wall. I took down the high-gloss prints left over from the previous owner photos that looked more like advertisements than memories. In their place, I began curating a new collection. I called it The Uninvited. Each photo featured someone whose story didn't fit neatly inside a frame. A grandmother who wasn't allowed to hold her grandchild at the hospital. A father left out of college graduation photos. A stepdaughter who stood in the back of her own family portrait. They came to me with slivers of dignity missing, and I offered them something rare. A portrait that told the truth without apology. One photo showed a man holding 2 invitations, one to his son's wedding, and one to his ex-wife's second wedding, with the same man. The caption read, he RSVP'd to neither, but he still dressed up and smiled for me. Visitors would pause there. Some teared up, others just nodded. Because pain, when seen clearly, becomes shared. One afternoon, just before closing, a young man walked in. Maybe early 30s, nervous energy. Kept twisting his car keys in his hand like he wanted to open a door but didn't know where it led. "You Frank Delaney?" I nodded. He stepped forward. "You photographed my fiancée's family last year." The Harlows. Christmas shoot in the park. I remembered them. Big smiles. Too practiced. He glanced around the room, then lowered his voice. "They don't want me to invite my dad to the wedding." Said it would change the tone. He was in prison for 10 years. Got clean. Stayed clean. Works at the hardware store now. Quiet guy. I waited. He looked up. I don't want to cut him out. I just don't want to ruin her day. I studied him, then asked, "Whose day is it, really?" He didn't answer, so I told him the only thing I could, the truth. I wasn't invited to my daughter's wedding either. She called it a clean start, but what she didn't understand was that every clean start requires a buried past, and sometimes the past comes back, not to ruin the day, but to remind you what made the day matter. He swallowed hard, then nodded, and left. That night, I received an email from Emma. Short. Simple. "I read your new column, the one about the man who wasn't allowed at the christening. I felt every word. Do you have time for lunch this weekend? Just us." I didn't smile. Smiles are too thin for that kind of message. But I exhaled something I hadn't known I was holding, and wrote back, "Saturday, 12:30, the diner on Main. Same booth as always." Dad, Saturday came. I wore the navy shirt she once bought me for Father's Day when she was 12. It was faded now, collar a little curled, but it still fit. And more importantly, it still meant something. She arrived a few minutes late, hair pulled back in a loose braid. No makeup, no performance. Just Emma. She slid into the booth and looked around. "Feels smaller? You got taller." She smiled faintly. "I used to sit here with my feet swinging under the table." I nodded. "You used to order strawberry milk and fries, then dunk the fries in the milk." She laughed, a real one this time. "That sounds disgusting now." It was disgusting then. We sat in a comfortable silence. Two people with enough shared memory to bridge the quiet. Finally, she said, "I haven't changed my name yet. I mean, I signed it on forms, but legally, I haven't done it." I stirred my coffee. She continued, "I thought maybe changing it would give me a fresh identity. Something lighter, cleaner. But instead, it felt like throwing away the part of me that could still walk into this booth and know who she was." I didn't tell her what to do. I just said, "Names can change, but blood doesn't smudge that easy." She reached across the table. Her hand rested over mine, calloused from years of darkroom knobs and sanding frames. "I'm sorry, Dad." For pretending I was someone else, I looked at her, really looked. "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "You owe yourself permission to stop running from what's true." She blinked, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her eyes. Not just as a woman, not just as someone else's wife, but as my daughter again. After lunch, we stood outside the diner in the sun. She hesitated, then asked, "Would you take a photo of me?" I raised an eyebrow. "Just me?" No filters, no edits, no posing, just how I am. Now I opened my trunk, pulled out the old camera bag. She stood in front of the brick wall, hands in her coat pockets, wind catching a strand of hair across her cheek. I didn't tell her how to stand. I didn't tell her how to smile. I just lifted the camera and clicked. And there it was. Not revenge, not proof. Redemption. Click. A daughter seen by the man she once forgot. Click. A father no longer invisible. Click. A picture they'd both want to remember. The photo of Emma stood on my desk for 3 days before I framed it. I didn't rush. Some moments need time to breathe before they're preserved. It was a quiet portrait. No extravagant smile. No dramatic background. Just her, standing against the aged red brick, wind tugging gently at her hair, eyes steady. For the first time in years, she looked unmasked. And more than that, she looked whole. I printed it in matte, the way I always did when I wanted a photo to feel lived in. Then I placed it next to the one of her at 10, the frosting on her nose, the blue ribbon, the wide-open joy of childhood. 2 versions of my daughter, side by side. Not as proof of change, but of continuity, of who she had been and who she was brave enough to become again. On Thursday, Emma called again. Would you come over?" she asked. "To the house?" "Yes. I want you to meet someone." I hesitated. It wasn't fear. It was memory. I'd seen that house only in photos, in rehearsal dinner shots, in curated moments where I had been the ghost behind the lens. "You sure that's a good idea?" I asked gently. "I think it's overdue," she said. When I pulled into their driveway that evening, the porch light was already on. The house was modest but neat white siding, hydrangeas under the windows, and a rocking chair on the front porch that looked like it had never been rocked in. Emma greeted me at the door, nervous. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, eyeing the manila folder in my hand. "It's not a gift," I said. "Just something I thought you should have." She opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, the walls were painted soft gray, the kind of color chosen for neutrality, not personality. Thomas wasn't home. That was her doing, I could tell. But sitting on the couch, legs dangling, was a little boy. Maybe 5 or 6 years old, with a mop of dark curls and a pair of eyes I recognized instantly. He looked up, cautious, curious. "Ben," Emma said, crouching next to him. "This is your grandpa." He tilted his head. "My what?" "Your mommy's dad," she said gently. The boy studied me, then asked, "Is he the one in the pictures in the red box?" Emma blinked. "You remember that?" He nodded. "You said not to touch them." I swallowed hard. She turned to me. "I kept them. I told myself I didn't need them anymore, but I couldn't throw them away." "I'm glad you didn't," I said. Ben stood and walked over. "Do you like dinosaurs?" he asked. I smiled. I used to, especially the ones that looked scarier than they really were. He grinned. "That's the raptors." Smart kid. Emma watched us quietly, arms crossed but not defensively, just holding herself. Ben grabbed a toy from the floor and began showing me how its tail moved. I sat on the rug with him, letting him explain its battle cry and the sound it made when it walked on hardwood floors. For a moment, the years fell away, not because they stopped mattering, but because they no longer held power over what was possible now. Later, after Ben had gone to bed, Emma and I sat in the kitchen. I handed her the manila folder. Inside were prints. Not of her. Of me. Old ones. Self-portraits I'd taken over the years. Me in the workshop, hands covered in wood dust. Me looking out the hospital window the day she was born. Me holding a camera in the mirror on her graduation day, the day I wasn't invited. She turned them slowly, page by page. "I thought you only ever took pictures of me," she said quietly. "I took pictures to remember," I said, "and sometimes to survive." She wiped at her eyes. Ben asked me last week why you weren't in any of his baby pictures, she said, and I realized I'd created a story so clean it was sterile. Stories don't need to be clean, I said. They need to be true. Before I left, she walked me to the porch. There was a moment heavy with emotion, but no words were exchanged. Instead, she reached out and hugged me. A full, honest embrace. No stiffness. No staged poses. And just before I stepped off the porch, she said softly, "Would you maybe take some pictures of Ben, the way you used to take them of me?" I nodded, fighting the lump in my throat. I'd be honored. She hesitated, then added, "And maybe one of the three of us." I turned. "The three of us?" She smiled. "You, me, and the part of us I almost lost." That night, I stood in my studio under the red light again, not to develop film, but to hang a new sign on the gallery wall. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without fear. And beneath it, the next frame was already waiting empty, but ready. Because healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it walks in, curly-haired and barefoot, holding a plastic dinosaur. And sometimes it simply says, "Hi, Grandpa." The next Saturday morning, I packed up my old Canon, 2 lenses, and a fresh roll of film. Yes, film. Most people have forgotten how to shoot on it, but I still trust it more than any screen. Film doesn't lie. It doesn't autocorrect joy or crop out sorrow. It simply waits, light pouring into it, memory after memory, burned into the grain like truth into a scar. Emma had texted the night before, "Bring the camera that clicks slow," the one that used to scare the cat. That meant she remembered. When I arrived, Ben ran to the front porch holding a stick like a knight's sword. He wore mismatched socks, a peanut butter smear on his shirt, and the wild curiosity only kids have before the world starts teaching them to sit still and smile on cue. He looked at the camera hanging around my neck and said, "Is that the dinosaur one?" "Sort of," I chuckled. "It's old, but it still roars." He grinned and turned back into the house. "Mom, Grandpa brought the roar camera." Emma stepped out a moment later, coffee in hand, her hair still damp from the shower. "You ready?" she asked. "Always." She hesitated, then said, "No filters today." I wouldn't dare. We started in the backyard. Ben climbed onto a tire swing, while Emma stood beneath the old oak, arms crossed but laughing. I didn't pose them. I just watched. Watched as Emma tickled her son until he squealed. Watched as she held him close after he tripped on a rock. Watched as her smile stretched across her face. Not wide, not exaggerated. Just real. I shot every frame. Click. Ben looking up at her like she was the entire world. Click. Emma brushing dirt off his knee. Click. The two of them collapsed in the grass, out of breath, eyes closed, perfectly unaware of being watched. And then, finally, Emma stood and walked over to me. "Now us," she said. I handed her the camera. She blinked. "You want me to take it?" "No," I said, nodding toward the deck. "There's a tripod. Let's set the timer." We stood side by side, her arm through mine, Ben in front of us, small hands gripping my thumbs. 10 seconds. The shutter clicked. It wasn't perfect. Emma's hair was windblown. Ben was mid-blink. I was slightly hunched from crouching. But God help me, it was true. I'd spent so long outside the frame, and now I was back in it. Not as a caption, not as a side note. As family. We printed the photo that afternoon at my studio. Emma insisted on watching the process. The darkroom magic. The slow fade in of shapes and outlines like ghosts coming home. When the photo finally developed, she stared at it for a long time. "He looks like you," she said of Ben. I nodded. "He laughs like you did when you were little." She touched the corner of the print. "I thought I'd lost this version of us." "You didn't lose it," I said. "You just forgot where you stored it." A few days later, I added the photo to the gallery wall. I called it Re-Entry. Not dramatic, just a title that said, "I was here. I still am." Beneath it, I placed a small wooden shelf, just big enough for one object. On it, I rested a toy dinosaur. Plastic, cheap, missing a tail, but full of meaning. A reminder that memory isn't something you hold with your hands. It's something you hand down, even in the smallest, strangest ways. That evening, I received a letter. A real one. Envelope. Stamp. No return address. I opened it with care. Inside was a single photograph, clearly from the wedding. I hadn't seen this one. It was Emma, standing in front of the honor chair. Except this time, her eyes weren't on the guests or the aisle. She was looking down at the chair, and in her hands, she held the bill. The note that came with it read, "This was the moment." The one where I knew I got it wrong. I didn't cry that day, but my hands were shaking. I didn't send it to hurt you. I sent it because I didn't know how to keep you close without making everything awkward. I thought the chair would be enough. It wasn't. Thank you for not staying gone. I love you, Emma. I held the letter in my hands, the photo resting on my lap. Then I turned it over and wrote in pencil, "This is where the story broke." And beneath that, on the back of the photo of the three of us I'd framed that morning, I wrote, "This is where the story healed." Because revenge was never the goal. Recognition was. A seat at the table, a place in the frame, a moment where the man behind the lens finally got to be part of the picture. And now he is. Time is not linear when it comes to forgiveness. Some days, Emma and I speak twice about Ben's loose tooth, or which film stock to use for autumn shots. Other days pass in silence, not cold, just still, like a lake at dawn before it remembers how to ripple. But healing isn't about noise, it's about return. And Emma kept returning. She stopped by the studio one afternoon while I was photographing a widower and her golden retriever. She didn't interrupt, just stood at the door and waited until I was done. When the shoot wrapped and the client left with her eyes a little wetter than when she came in, Emma stepped forward, holding a shoebox. "What's that?" I asked. She handed it to me. Inside were photos. Hundreds, maybe more. "I found them in Mom's attic," she said. "Most of them are ours. Some are yours. And a few, well, I guess I wasn't supposed to see them." I pulled out a photo from the top. It was a shot of me, taken from behind, sitting at the foot of Emma's bed, reading her a story. I couldn't have been more than 35. My hair was darker, my posture straighter, but the shape of me was unmistakable present. Emma sat on the floor as I flipped through them. One by one, moments returned. The day she lost her first tooth. Dash, her science fair with the crooked volcano. A candid of her asleep in the back seat, with her face pressed to the window, crayon still clutched in her hand. "I didn't know Mom took these," I whispered. "She didn't," Emma said. "You did. But you never printed them." I looked at her. "I remember things now, Dad," she said softly. "Things I'd buried so deep, I started to believe they'd never happened." She reached into the box and pulled out a final envelope. "This one," she said, "is for you to decide." Inside was a photo I'd taken, but forgotten about the proposal. Not Emma's. Mine. To her mother. I'd taken it with the self-timer, the camera hidden behind a couch cushion. I was down on one knee. Her mother was covering her mouth in shock, the ring barely visible in my hand. The image was raw, slightly blurred, off-center, but honest. "This is your story too," Emma said. "Not just mine. Not just hers. Hours I spent the weekend restoring the prints. One by one, I cleaned them, scanned them, archived them. Not because I intended to publish them. Some stories belong in boxes, not headlines, but because memory deserves respect. And for the first time, I saw something I'd never let myself fully acknowledge. I had been a good father. Not perfect, not always appreciated, but present, committed, true. Emma called me again the following Tuesday. "I want to do something," she said, "for the community, for the people you photograph." "Okay," I replied. "What are you thinking? A gallery, at the library, or maybe the town hall, somewhere public. We'll call it The Truth We Keep. Every subject signs off. We show the unvarnished versions, the real faces, and beside every photo, a handwritten note from the person in it." I was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's the kind of thing your younger self would have rolled her eyes at." She laughed. "I know. That's how I know I've changed." We started sorting through my archive that week. She came every night after Ben was asleep. She brought takeout and sat cross-legged on the floor, labeling photos with sticky notes while I worked the scanner and printer. Some of the photos were hard to look at. A veteran in hospice holding a photo of himself at 19. A single mother staring at the eviction notice taped to her door. A young man sitting beside an empty chair where his brother should have been. But Emma didn't look away. She read every caption, asked every question, and when she didn't understand the pain in someone's eyes, she simply said, "I want to." That was enough. The night before we sent the first round to the print house, Emma pulled out one more photo, one I hadn't seen in years. It was her wedding, the only photo I had chosen to keep, not because of her dress, or the flowers, or the guests, but because of her eyes. She looked happy, but not honest. Emma stared at it, then said, "We should include this one." "You sure?" I asked. She nodded. "With a new caption." I handed her a pen. She wrote slowly, carefully. "The day I forgot who I was, and who he'd always been." The gallery went up 3 weeks later. Opening night was modest. Just a few families, a couple of town officials, and a high school teacher who remembered me from when I used to drop Emma off in 3rd grade. But the emotion in the room? Big. People stood in front of their own images and cried, not because they were embarrassed, but because for once they felt seen. And in the center of it all, between the soldier and the mother, between the boy with the birthday balloon and the woman who had just left a shelter, was the photo of me, Emma, and Ben arms wrapped, crooked smiles, a little messy, untouched. A printed note beside it read, "Healing doesn't mean erasing what broke. It means learning to frame it differently." Emma wrote that. She stood beside me, watching a child point up at the photo and say, "That's a grandpa!" And for the first time since the day the bill arrived in my mailbox, I felt something loosen inside me, like a knot finally untied. Not because the past had changed, but because the present finally had room for it. The exhibit stayed up longer than expected. 2 weeks became 4. Then the mayor stopped by. Then the local paper ran a second piece, this time not about me, but about the project. They called it a healing space in frame and ink. Visitors came not to admire the lighting or the angles, but to stand in front of photos of people like themselves. Unretouched, unvarnished, unforgettable. Some came to find peace. Others came to find proof. One afternoon, an elderly man with sunspots on his hands walked up to the wall where his portrait hung him. Sitting on his porch with a shoebox full of letters from his late wife. He stared at it for nearly 10 minutes, then turned to Emma and said, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would ever ask to see me as I really am." Emma started bringing Ben with her to the studio on weekends. He'd sit on the floor with a toy truck, occasionally interrupting our work to ask important questions like, "Do ghosts get tired? Or can cameras see feelings?" I told him the truth. Ghosts don't get tired. That's why we still feel them. And cameras? They don't see feelings, Ben. But they know when someone's telling the truth. He seemed satisfied with that. Later, when he curled up on the old couch in the corner and fell asleep mid-sentence, Emma looked over at me. "You know what's strange?" she asked. "What?" "I trust you more now than I ever did growing up." I looked at her, surprised. She shrugged. "Back then, you were just safe, reliable, constant. I didn't know how to appreciate that. And now? Now, I know what it's like to feel lost. And I understand what it means to have someone who doesn't move, even when you push them away." The next column I published was different. Not a story about being forgotten. Not about pain or revenge. It was about restoration. About how stories that seemed broken beyond repair were often just waiting for the right person to finish writing them. I wrote, "They sent me a bill for a seat they never offered me, and instead of disappearing, I bought the building where the pictures lived. I didn't do it to shame them. I did it to save the truth before it was deleted. That's what fathers do. They don't fight for the spotlight. They fight for the frame to include everyone who mattered, even the ones who tried to crop them out." The column was picked up nationally. Letters came in from all over from men and women who had been ghosted by their own families, who had been quietly funding milestones they were never invited to celebrate. And not all were bitter. Some just wanted to be remembered. Just like me. One evening, Emma and I sat on the front porch, Ben asleep inside. She rested her head on my shoulder. "You know," she said, "there was a moment during the wedding, after the vows, during the dance, I felt like something was off, like I was performing for everyone else, but no one there really knew me." I stayed quiet. She went on. "I kept thinking, if Dad were here, he'd know I wasn't okay." I turned to her gently. I knew. Even from far away, she nodded. "I think I wanted to punish you," she admitted. "For divorcing Mom, for not being loud, for being too kind, when what I really wanted was to see someone fight." "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize the people who love you quietly are the ones who never leave, even when you don't see them in the crowd." A few days later, I got a call from Thomas. I didn't recognize the number at first, but his voice was unmistakable and measured, professional, rehearsed. He started with small talk, asked how Ben was doing in school, then cleared his throat and got to the point. "Emma told me about the gallery, about everything you two have been working on." I waited. He exhaled slowly. "I think I owe you an apology." That caught me off guard. "I was trying to build a clean life," he said. "And in doing so, I encouraged Emma to erase the messier parts of her past." "Including you? You mean the parts with texture?" I replied. "The parts that made her real." He paused, then said, "Yes." "Those, I'm not interested in being forgiven," I said. "Not by you." "I understand." There was another pause. Then, quietly, "But I'm glad she found her way back to you." I hung up, not with closure, not with resolution, but with something better. Clarity. Not every conversation ends in reconciliation. Sometimes it just ends without bitterness, and that's enough. That night, I looked at the gallery wall again. It was nearly full. Every story captured, every caption handwritten. But one frame sat empty, waiting. I sat down at my desk and opened a new folder titled For Ben. Inside, I began writing letters, one for his 10th birthday, one for the day he graduates, one for the day he becomes a father, if he chooses to. Not because I expect him to need them, but because memory is easier to carry when someone else packs it for you. And I want him to know that long before he was old enough to understand cameras, he was already helping heal a man who once stood outside the frame. Because sometimes revenge fades, but legacy, that stays in focus forever. There's a peculiar silence that fills a room when you finish telling your truth. It's not the silence of absence, it's the silence of arrival. In the weeks following the gallery's quiet success and the unexpected call from Thomas, I began noticing something I hadn't felt in years. Not peace, exactly, but weightlessness. Not because everything had healed perfectly, but because I had finally stopped carrying what wasn't mine to hold. Emma and I continued to work together on the photography series. Ben became a part-time apprentice, insisting he could be camera boss, even though he mostly pressed random buttons and asked if lenses could see through walls. He made us laugh often. That, in itself, was therapy. But beneath the surface of joy, I began to feel another stir, a quiet invitation, to step back into something I had long avoided, my past. One morning, I took a drive I hadn't taken in over 20 years, not for work, not for groceries, for closure. The road out to the house where Emma was born still curved the same way, past the old grain mill, past the school where I once waited in the pickup line with a coffee mug in hand and a worried heart in my chest. The house had changed. New paint, new shutters, a swing set in the front yard that didn't belong to me. But it was still ours, once. I didn't go in, didn't knock. I stood on the sidewalk, camera in hand, and took a photo of the front porch, the place where I once taught Emma to tie her shoes, where I waited for her after her first homecoming dance, where I cried the night Eleanor asked for a divorce. The shutter clicked, and I whispered, "You can let go now." I returned home and placed that photo in a separate album, not for public display, just for me. The places that raised us. That's what I wrote on the spine. Later that week, I received an invitation in the mail, a formal one this time, embossed paper, gold lettering. "Mr. Frank Delaney, you are cordially invited to attend the renewal of vows ceremony for Emma and Thomas Hale." There was a handwritten note tucked inside. "This time, you're not just invited. You're walking me down the aisle. If you say yes." Emma. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because something inside me cracked open. Not in pain, in grace. The next morning, I walked into the studio and made one change to the wall. I took down the uninvited section. Not because those stories didn't matter, but because mine had changed. And I didn't want to keep anchoring myself to the moment I was excluded, when now I was being welcomed back in fully. I replaced it with a new section, the return. And the first frame I hung was a photo of the vow renewal invitation. Not the event, not the people, just the invite. Because sometimes healing is just that, a second envelope that corrects the cruelty of the first. The ceremony was held in the park near the chapel where Emma was baptized. Nothing grand, just wildflowers, folding chairs, and a small string quartet tucked under a maple tree. I stood with Emma behind a silk curtain while the guests arrived. She was calm this time, not shaking, not performing. "I was scared last time," she admitted. "Scared to have you there. Scared you'd remind me of who I really was." "You mean loved?" I said. She smiled. "Exactly." The music started. She looked at me and asked, "Are you ready?" I adjusted my tie, took her arm, and replied, "I've been ready since the day you were born." As we walked down the aisle, I saw faces turn, some shocked, some smiling, some teary. But I kept my eyes on one thing, Emma's. She didn't look away. Not this time. And when we reached Thomas, he extended his hand and whispered, "Thank you." For everything you gave her that I never understood, I nodded, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. That evening, we gathered under lanterns strung between trees. Ben danced with his mom. I sat at a small table, sipping sweet tea, watching. Then Emma walked over and pulled out a chair. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go on." "I want to open a second gallery," she said. "A traveling exhibit. We'll bring the project to other towns, other people who've felt forgotten, left out, edited out." I raised my eyebrow. "You sure you want to carry all that?" She smiled. "I'm not carrying it alone. I have you. I have Ben. I have what you built." I reached for her hand across the table, and I said, "Then let's go show the world what it looks like when a story gets told the right way." That night, I returned home and walked into the dark room one last time, not to develop a photo, but to hang one. The final one, a self-portrait me in the mirror, camera in hand, half smiling, half tired, eyes soft with peace. Under it, I placed a quote. Not from a book, not from a client, from Emma. He never needed to be in the picture to matter. But I see him now, and I always will, because revenge was never the destination. It was the detour, the long, hard, necessary path that brought us back to where we always should have been, together. The vow renewal ceremony marked a shift, not just in Emma's life, but in mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in reaction. I wasn't archiving pain or editing around the gaps. I was present, not just in frames, but in feelings. And yet, I found myself waking up the next morning with an unexpected question lingering in my chest. Now what? Because sometimes, when you've fought so long to be seen, it's hard to know what to do once you are. I opened the studio that Monday like any other day. Same creaky floorboard, same burnt coffee smell from the old drip pot. But something was different. The wall of truth was full. The gallery, the return complete. The inbox was light, the cameras charged, the light diffused through the east window just right. And still, I stood in the middle of it all, not photographing, not editing, not writing, just listening. To what? I didn't know, until I heard the small bell over the door. Ben burst through like a storm wrapped in denim. "Grandpa! Grandpa! I lost my other front tooth!" He grinned wide to prove it. Emma followed behind him, slower, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a folder under her arm. "I thought we could help you reorganize the archive," she said. "You sure that's not code for I brought you work to do?" I teased. She grinned. "Maybe a little." Ben was already behind the front desk, turning the swivel chair like it was a spaceship. As Emma and I began sorting through the folder, she pulled out a document I hadn't seen before. "What's this?" I asked. "It's a proposal," she said, "for a foundation." I looked at her, brows raised. "A what now?" She smiled. "The Delaney Archive, a non-profit storytelling initiative. We collect real stories, photos, letters, especially from people who feel left out of their own families or histories, and we make sure their voices get heard." I blinked. She continued, "There are too many people like you, Dad. People erased from weddings, from birthdays, from milestones. We can't fix every family, but we can preserve their truth before it disappears." I opened the proposal. Her writing was clear, professional, but emotionally sharp. It was her, fully. "Do you think people would actually donate to something like this?" I asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think people are hungry for stories that don't skip the pain just to get to the happy ending." We launched the website 2 months later. .thedelaneyarchive.org. The tagline, "For the forgotten, the edited, the uninvited, your story matters." Submissions poured in. A woman in Vermont sent a photo of her and her mother, reunited after 30 years of silence. A man from Arizona wrote a letter to the father he never met, then asked if we'd post it, somewhere public, in case he ever Googles my name. A teenager from Georgia submitted a voice memo. "They always tell me I'm too sensitive, that I remember things wrong. But I don't. I know what happened. I just want someone else to believe me." We did. We published them all. Each photo paired with its story. Each letter transcribed by hand. Each voice recorded as it was. Shaky, raw, untrained. No edits. No filters. Just truth. One afternoon, I received a message through the website from a woman named Carla. She wrote, "Mr. Delaney, I read your story, the one about the wedding. Mine was the opposite. My father showed up at my wedding uninvited. I hadn't seen him in years. We'd ended badly. He sat in the back, never said a word. When I found out later, I was furious, until I saw the one photo my cousin took by accident. Me walking down the aisle, him in the background, just watching with this expression, like he was memorizing me one last time." I haven't stopped thinking about that photo. I want to submit it. I want the world to know that sometimes the people we push out are the ones who never stop showing up. Thank you for helping me forgive him, even if I never got to say it face to face. I printed her photo and hung it near the front door of the studio. It wasn't just her story. It was mine. It was Emma's. It was ours. Later that week, Emma and I sat in the darkroom, not to develop film, but to make a list. A dream list. A traveling exhibition. A documentary. A published collection of letters. A scholarship for young photographers who've lost someone. A children's book about telling the truth through pictures. Each item a little ambitious. Each one possible. She looked at me and said, "You know what's wild?" "What?" "This all started because of a bill." I laughed. "An invoice for a chair I never sat in." She nodded. "And now you're at the head of the table." That night, I pulled out the very first envelope, the one that started it all. The wedding invoice. I'd kept it, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. I framed it. Just a small one, tucked away behind the studio door. And underneath, I wrote, "Sometimes exclusion is just the world's awkward way of making room for something bigger." Then I turned out the lights, locked the door, and drove home. Past the chapel, past the old school, past the house where the porch swing still creaked. And I thought, maybe this isn't about getting back into the frame after all. Maybe it's about holding the camera long enough to give it to someone else. The more stories we collected, the more I began to realize something quietly profound. People didn't just want to be remembered. They wanted to be believed. A photo can show a face, sure, but a story, if told, right shows the soul. And that became the new mission of the Delaney Archive, to help people reclaim the narrative that others had stolen, rewritten, or tried to erase. We set up an old post office box just outside the studio. No digital forms, no hashtags, just paper and pen. And they came. Letters folded into napkins, Polaroids wrapped in ribbon, scrapbooks with tear-stained pages and captions scribbled in all caps. Every week, Emma, Ben, and I would open them like sacred things. One envelope caught us off guard. It was hand-delivered, no stamp, no return address, just a single line written on the back. He took the blame, so we wouldn't. Inside was a single photograph. An old man in overalls, standing outside a run-down house, his hands filthy with engine grease, his eyes utterly gentle. Tucked beside the photo was a newspaper clipping from 1987. Father of 4 pleads guilty in local burglary, sentenced to 10 years. The handwritten note beneath it told a different story. It wasn't him. We were the ones. Me and my older brother. He found out. Took the blame so we wouldn't be ruined before we even had a shot. He served the time. Came home to a town that whispered. Never corrected the record. We never said thank you. Maybe this helps. Emma read it aloud, her voice cracking near the end. Ben looked up from the floor where he was coloring and asked, "Why would someone take the blame if they didn't do it?" Emma looked to me. I paused, then answered, "Because sometimes being a father means protecting your child's future, even if it costs you your own." That story haunted me for days, not in a frightening way, in a grieving way, because I knew that kind of father. I had been that kind of father, not with a jail sentence, but with sacrifice no one ever clapped for. The jobs I didn't take because they kept me away from Emma's bedtime. The weekends I gave up to fix the roof, or help with algebra, or hold space for a daughter who didn't yet understand how steady I was trying to be. Fathers like that don't make the news. They don't trend, but they endure. Emma and I wrote back to that anonymous sender. We included a reprint of the photo cleaned up, rebalanced, reframed, with a new caption underneath, "The man who stood where no one else had the courage to." We mailed it to the only clue we had, a P.O. box number scratched onto the back of the original envelope. 2 weeks later, we received a reply. Just 4 words. He hung it up. The Delaney Archive began attracting media attention. Podcasts, public radio. A small documentary crew from Minnesota showed up with cameras and questions, and more enthusiasm than gear. But we didn't let it become spectacle. We kept it small, human, sacred. Emma was fiercely protective of that. One day, a TV producer called and asked if we'd be willing to host a live reunion between a woman and the mother who had given her up for adoption and never looked back. Emma politely declined. "I don't do theater," she said. "We don't fix people for ratings." That night, over dinner, she explained why she'd said no. "I think the world wants transformation to look big," she said, "like someone sobbing in a spotlight. But the real stuff, the real healing, it happens in quiet corners, in mailboxes, in galleries, in cups of coffee between people who finally stop pretending they're okay." She looked at me. "You taught me that." I didn't reply, just reached across the table and took her hand. Ben, now older and wiser at 6 1/2, asked one morning if he could run the studio for a day. We said yes. He stood behind the front desk wearing a name tag that read, Boss of Feelings. Every person who came in, he greeted with, "Hi. Do you want to tell your truth today?" Some laughed, some cried. One woman hugged him so tight, Emma had to gently intervene. Later, Ben asked me why people cry when they look at pictures. I thought for a long moment before saying, because when a photo tells the truth, it brings the heart out of hiding. He nodded solemnly, like when I used to hide under the table after Mom yelled at the blender. Exactly like that. I smiled. That night, I found an old voicemail from Emma saved from over a year ago. I'd forgotten I even had it. She was younger in her voice, unsure, defensive, even. "Hey, it's me. I know I said things that were harsh. I don't know how to unhurt people. You probably won't call back. That's fine. I wish I remembered more of what you did right. Because I think I'm realizing it was a lot." I sat with it in the dark studio, the voicemail looping once before stopping. Then I clicked delete. Not because I didn't want to hear it again, but because I didn't need to. I had the real thing now, not just the memory, the relationship. Before locking up that night, I updated the gallery. A new section, a single photo. Ben, sitting at the front desk, head down, drawing quietly, one hand holding a crayon, the other resting gently on a stack of black and white prints. The caption read, "May the next generation carry our truth, not our silence." And beneath it, in Emma's handwriting, "For the father who stayed, even when he wasn't invited." It was fall again. The leaves in Chapel Hill flared in that quiet blaze of orange and gold that always reminded me of Emma's childhood hair before time, and decisions dulled the color into something more grown up. Before silence crept into the places where laughter used to live. Before an empty chair showed up at a wedding with my name on the invoice. Now, the world looked different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. And with each turning leaf, I found myself stepping further away from the wound and closer toward the work. The Delaney archive had grown beyond what either of us expected. A librarian in Wisconsin reached out to start a community wall. A veterans center in Oregon submitted a batch of letters from soldiers who'd never been welcomed home. A high school teacher in Ohio used our stories to teach students about perspective, about apology, about how a picture without context can be both beautiful and brutally incomplete. But it was one letter in particular that landed on my desk, one cool Thursday afternoon that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't from a stranger, it was from Eleanor, my ex-wife, Emma's mother, the woman who years ago stood on the opposite end of the courtroom and said the words, "irreconcilable differences," like she was placing a book back on the shelf and walking away. Frank, Emma told me about the archive, and the gallery, and Ben's photo. I've watched from a distance, maybe too far, maybe too long. I know I played a part in how things unfolded. I didn't just watch Emma walk away from you, I gave her permission to. I thought I was protecting her, but I think I was protecting myself. Because I knew you were always the one who stayed, even when I didn't. I'm not writing to ask for a meeting or to reopen old wounds. I'm writing to say something I never said loud enough when it mattered. Thank you for giving her the kind of love that outlasted everything I tried to replace it with. I hope you're well. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it, carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I keep the wedding invoice and the first birthday card Emma ever made for Miki. Construction paper, glitter, misspelled words, and all. A part of me wanted to write back, but the other part, the older, slower part, understood that some truths don't need a reply, just a home. That Sunday, Emma came to the studio with something under her arm, a framed photo of me and Eleanor Young, beaming, holding a newborn Emma swaddled in a blanket that looked far too big for her tiny fists. "Mom sent it," she said. "She said it was time this went where it belonged." I took the frame from her hands. It felt like holding a timeline that had healed without anyone noticing. "Do you want to hang it?" I asked. Emma shook her head. "No, I want you to." So I did. I placed it near the archive entrance, not hidden, not spotlighted, just there. No caption, no context, just us, as we once were. And beneath it, I slid a blank piece of paper, a sign that some stories don't need explanations, just room to be seen again. Ben wandered in later that day, with a sheet of paper he'd scribbled on in red marker. "Look," he grinned. "I made your next story." He held it up proudly. It was stick figures mostly. One big figure, one medium, one small. All holding hands under what I think was meant to be a rainbow or possibly a fire. In the corner, he'd written, backwards and sloppily, "My family loves real stuff." Emma laughed, kneeling beside him. I read it again, slower this time. "My family loves real stuff." And somehow, those 5 misspelled words summed up everything we'd been building. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a small-town symposium. The theme was the future of memory. Most speakers brought PowerPoint slides and academic citations. I brought a shoebox. I placed it on the podium and opened it slowly, pulling out a handful of photos from the archive. Not the ones with perfect lighting. The ones with trembling hands, with crooked smiles, with stains on the tablecloth, and people in the background who were no longer welcome, but still deeply missed. I said, "This isn't just a photo. This is proof that someone was here, that they mattered, that they showed up whether they were invited or not. The future of memory isn't about who gets posted. It's about who gets preserved. And sometimes, the people who never make it into the scrapbook are the ones who loved you the longest." There was no applause at first, just stillness. Then someone in the back stood up. Then another. And then the entire room. Not for the speech, but for the people behind the pictures. When I got home, Emma was waiting on my porch with 2 mugs of cider and a folded piece of paper. "I think we should go national," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "The archive?" I asked. She nodded. "We set up booths in different cities, train volunteers, teach people how to preserve stories before they're forgotten." "And what would we call it?" I asked. She smiled, holding up the paper. It was Ben's drawing. "My family loves real stuff." "That," she said. "That's the name." And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was perfect. That night, I added one more photo to the wall. Not of me, not of Emma, not even of Ben. Just a simple shot of a chair. The same kind they used at her first wedding. The one marked honor seat. Empty. But in this photo, there was no sign, no rope, no ghost. Just a man-me sitting in it. And underneath it, I wrote, "Not every seat needs an invitation." Some of us earned it the hard way. I never imagined I'd be back in a high school gymnasium at my age, let alone standing behind a table full of black and white portraits while a student council volunteer handed me a name tag that read, "Frank Delaney, Memory Curator." They were holding a community event part art show, part storytelling fair, and the Delaney Archive had been invited as a featured exhibitor. Emma was setting up across the gym with Ben, who wore a tiny blazer over a Captain America shirt and kept telling everyone he was the vice grandpa. I stood at our booth, arranging the photos, each one paired with a brief handwritten caption. He never spoke about the war, but he flinched when the wind slammed the screen door. They said she cried too much. Her daughter called it compassion. The last time he smiled was when he gave away the ring he couldn't afford to keep. And then, front and center, was mine. The chair photo, the one from the vow renewal. This time, no sign, no plaque, just a seat. Filled. Several parents stopped to look. A young man pointed and said, "That's the one from the article, right?" The dad they didn't invite? I smiled. "That's me?" He blinked, surprised. "Wait, seriously?" "Seriously." He stared a moment longer, then quietly said, "I didn't invite my dad to my wedding either." Silence stretched between us. Then he said, "We didn't talk for years." Last week, he sent me a picture of my old baseball glove, said he kept it in case I ever came back. He looked down. I didn't respond. I placed a hand on the table between us. You don't have to respond to everything right away. But some messages deserve to be carried with you until you're ready. He nodded, took a copy of our brochure, walked away slowly. Later that evening, after the crowd thinned out, Emma handed me a small brown envelope. "This came in from the P.O. box," she said. "No return address." "I think it's for you." I opened it. Inside was a short note. Typed. Neat. Formal. "To the man who turned pain into permanence. I saw my father once in a photo someone thought they'd deleted. It was a moment from my graduation, just beyond the crop. He was clapping, alone in the bleachers. Thank you for teaching me that being left out doesn't mean being gone." A daughter who finally looked back. I folded the note, placed it gently in my breast pocket. Some truths deserve to stay close to the heart. That weekend, Emma and I sat on the back porch, sipping tea while Ben ran around the yard with a plastic camera shouting, "Say truth!" I turned to her and said, "You know, for the longest time, I thought buying that photography company was revenge." She tilted her head. "Wasn't it?" "At first," I said, "but not now. Now I think it was rescue. Yeah, not of me, of us, of memory, of all the things that might have been buried under silence if I hadn't picked up the lens." She looked down at her mug. "I still have days," she said, "where I remember how I made you feel, and I hate myself for it." "Don't," I said. "We all cut people out when we're scared they'll remind us of who we are. But the ones who love us don't need to hold on to anger. They just hold the door open a little longer." Emma smiled, softly, wistfully. "Ben's going to grow up with this," she said. "The archive, the photos, the letters, the legacy he already has," I said. "He's the only 6-year-old I know who can explain what a darkroom is." She laughed, and then grew quiet again. "I want to make sure this doesn't end with us." "It won't," I said. "Truth always finds new storytellers." That night, I started a new journal. On the first page, I wrote, "This isn't a story about being left out. It's a story about refusing to disappear." And on the next page, I wrote the names of every person who had submitted a story, a photo, or a truth they had once buried. A growing list, not of victims, but of remembered people. People who would not be cropped out. The following Monday, we were contacted by a major publishing house. They wanted to compile the Delaney archive into a coffee table book. Emma was nervous. What if they want to clean it up too much? Make it too shiny? I smiled. Then we say no. This isn't for pretty books. It's for honest hearts. But they didn't want to change a thing. The title we chose was simple, The Uninvited, and the subtitle, Stories from the Edges of the Frame. We printed 1,000 copies. They sold out in 48 hours, not because of marketing, not because of hype, because people are starving for truth. Raw, undone, unapologetic. And once you taste it, you can never go back to pretending. At the back of the book, I wrote a note to the reader. If you were never thanked, this is for you. If you were edited out of the family photo, this is for you. If your love was quiet, and therefore forgotten, this is for you. You weren't invisible. They just didn't know how to look. The book changed everything. Not just for the archive, but for me. When the first printed copy arrived in the mail, a weighty hardcover, clean typography, that soft linen feel that asks to be held. I didn't flip to the middle or the photo sections. I opened to the back, to the final pages, where my story lived. The original photo, the chair, the caption, the invoice. Emma had included a small editor's note beneath it. This chapter of our family was once untold. Now it is unforgettable. I closed the book slowly, hands trembling, not with sadness, but with something I hadn't known I still had inside me. Completion. We hosted a launch event at the local library. Simple, wooden chairs. Free coffee. Framed prints lining the walls like old friends returning home. I expected 20 people, maybe 30. Over 100 showed up. Men in their 60s who hadn't spoken to their sons in years. Women who'd once buried journals in shoeboxes. Even teenagers, wide-eyed and tender, looking for a place to say the things they hadn't been able to say around their own kitchen tables. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about the wedding, or the bill, or the sting of exclusion. I said this: the hardest part about being forgotten isn't the absence, it's the silence that follows. I thought I had to shout to be heard, but I didn't. I just had to start telling the truth. Loud enough for someone else to recognize it as their own, and now, truth has a name. A home. A future. Then I lifted the book, opened it to the photo of Emma, Ben, and me, sitting on the bench in front of the gallery. We are what remains when bitterness passes, I said, and what remains is worth framing. A week later, something unexpected arrived. A check, large, from Thomas Hale. No note, just the memo line, for the chair. And the years I stared at it for a long time, then folded it into an envelope and handed it back to Emma. She asked, "What should I do with it?" "Start something," I said. She did. With it, she launched the Still Here Fund, a grant for single fathers trying to reconnect with their children after years of silence. It funded counseling, travel, legal assistance, and even small things like cameras, so they could begin building a new record, a record with them in it. Time passed. The archive grew. We traveled to 6 cities that year. Emma gave talks. Ben became the unofficial mascot, handing out truth badges to anyone brave enough to submit a story. He even made me one. A sticker, slightly crooked, red crayon around the edges. It read, "Grandpa, the first truth teller." I wore it proudly. Still do. One evening, Emma and I sat on the porch. She'd just returned from a speaking event at a women's shelter. She looked tired, but not worn down. Worn in. Like someone who'd learned how to carry purpose without letting it crush her. She turned to me and said, "Do you ever regret it? Buying the studio? Publishing the photos? Going public?" I shook my head. "No, I regret staying silent for as long as I did, but not the voice that came after." She leaned against my shoulder. "I think about the version of me who sent that bill," she whispered. "The girl who thought you were just a cost to be budgeted." And I think about the man who paid it, I replied. She looked up at me, tears glimmering in her eyes. I'm sorry for who I was then. I'm proud of who you are now, I said, and that's the only timeline I care about. Inside the house, Ben was asleep on the couch. A photo album rested on his chest, one of the old ones. He'd fallen asleep flipping through it. The page still open to a picture of me in my workshop. Camera in hand, a younger Emma helping me hold a light meter. Beneath it, someone, probably Emma, had scribbled, "The light was always here. We just had to stop cropping it out." The studio still stands. The archive continues. But now I've stepped back, not to retire, but to witness. Emma runs it with a team. Ben helps catalog submissions on weekends. The porch swing out front bears a plaque that reads, "For the uninvited, who became unforgettable." I sit there some mornings with coffee and a camera I rarely use anymore. People pass by and wave. Some stop. They tell me stories. They thank me. But I always say the same thing. Don't thank me. Thank the truth. It waited long enough. And as for that first chair, the one I was billed for, the one I never sat in, it sits now in the front lobby of the archive. A single chair, no velvet rope, no sign, except one, handwritten, framed. This seat is for the one who stayed, even when they were left out.